There's a new documentary showing in Scottish cinemas this week. Never Forget Tibet, the Dalai Lama's Untold Story, presents an in-depth account of the Dalai Lama's escape from Tibet to India, taking us back to 1959, when the Chinese government took control of the country, which forced the Dalai Lama into exile. The story is told through old footage and insightful interviews with prominent figures, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama, recounting his journey to freedom. Let's listen to a clip now. This is Harmander Singh, an officer in the Indian Frontier Administrative Service who played a crucial role in escorting the Dalai Lama across the border into India.
Srila Pass was 14,000 feet high, and it was a treacherous path, snowy even in summer months, and crossing it on ponies or on foot was an ordeal. You would have to take short steps, see that you don't fall, and cross boulders carefully.
That was a clip from the new documentary, Never Forget Tibet, the Dalai Lama's Untold Story. Joining us to explain the significance of this event and how it continues to impact Tibet and more broadly the world is Honorary Buddhist Chaplain and lecturer in the School of Psychology and Neuroscience at St Andrews University, Dr Sam Pehrson, and Dr Martin A. Mills, who's Senior Lecturer in Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen and Director of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research. Warm welcome to you both.
Morning.
Good morning. Martin, first of all, can you just give us some context about why the Dalai Lama fled Tibet in 1959 and the events that led up to his escape?
Sure, absolutely. Tibet was incorporated into the People's Republic of China, really actually in sort of military terms in about 1949 to 1950, around that period. Tibet's a huge place, so that's why I say 1949 to 1950. It's an area about 1 million square miles, so roughly speaking the size of Western Europe. After the People's Republic of China was formed by Mao in 1947, one of the first goals they saw was to effectively incorporate the regions of the Dalai Lama's government and the Tibetan Plateau as a whole into the People's Republic and to sort of engage in democratic and socialist reforms there. So that occurred in 1950, and the Tibetan army at that point in time was a relatively small. It was a small but slightly effective organization, but it simply didn't have a chance against kind of 80,000 hardened PLA troops that it was faced against. So effectively speaking, the Dalai Lama's government in Lhasa had to kind of capitulate to that military presence, and they signed over something called the 17-point agreement in 1951, something which they argued was done under duress. This then led to a long 10-year period of growing tension, particularly in the regions of sort of northern Tibet, places like Amdo and Kham, which were largely outside that 17-point agreement, to kind of go slow on reforms. And in that area in northern Tibet, which is now called Qinghai, massive socialist reforms were taking place. Buddhist monasteries were destroyed. Land reforms were land ownership was communalized. All of these things kind of happened, and it created both a kind of conflict and a massive refugee crisis in Tibet. Tibetans from the northern regions began flooding into Lhasa, and this really came to a head in 1958 to 1959, which really led to kind of a massive hothouse atmosphere around the Dalai Lama's government in Tibet. They were trying to balance things, but it proved very hard. And then finally, come March 1959, the enormous loyalty that Tibetans have for His Holiness was sort of tested when the Chinese authorities invited him without bodyguards, please, to a theatrical showing, and everyone thought he was going to be kidnapped. And so this enormous uprising took place in a sort of really kind of overpopulated Lhasa. Literally, Lhasa was now 3 times its normal population because of refugees. And this led to this confrontation, which was very much a one-sided confrontation. Tibet, Lhasa at the time was surrounded by PLA military camps. And so the Tibetans really didn't have very much of a chance. And in the midst of the conflict, His Holiness and key members of his government and lately 80,000 refugees kind of had to flee into exile to India.
And very clearly, the documentary documents part of that journey. Sam, if I can come to you, did the documentary provide any new information or perspective for you?
Well, I think the basic sort of facts of the history and the circumstances of the Dalai Lama's exile, I was already sort of familiar with those key facts. I guess what's valuable about the documentary is the first-hand accounts. So it's very nice to kind of hear those accounts from the Dalai Lama himself and also other people involved, like Harminder Singh. There's also a very touching reunion between the Dalai Lama and Harminder Singh, which is probably I'd say the core of the film. So those aspects I think are valuable, even if you already know a little bit about Tibet.
And sorry, I was going to ask how effective you think it was in conveying the political and social complexities of the situation in Tibet.
Well, I don't think the film probably aimed to reveal the complexities of the situation in Tibet, and I'm not sure that there's a documentary really that does that. So I don't think that's where the strengths are really. But certainly, whether you know something about Tibet or not, I think there are quite valuable things in there. I really liked there was probably more than usual highlighting the role of women in resistance. So it mentions the kind of leadership role of the Tibetan Women's Association in uprisings in 1959 that Martin mentioned, and also the role of nuns later on in Tibetan protests and resistance, and the kind of growing kind of confidence and strength of nuns within Tibetan Buddhism in exile as well. So that aspect I really liked as well.
Martin, what did you make of the documentary? And I suppose more broadly speaking, I think we have to look at perhaps the impact of the Dalai Lama's exile on Tibetan culture and society.
Yeah, my response is the film. I think the first time I watched it, my response was something a little like Sam's, but perhaps a little stronger. This was familiar ground. This was, the key writer, Rani Singh, for example, this is her uncle that met His Holiness when he was coming into exile. And so she's got a personal thing there. It does feed into what is sort of the general accepted mythology about Tibet. And I think there's a problem there, and I have to be blunt on this one. The film... Sam is correct that there are very few documentaries that really deal with the larger issues here. They tend to reduce Tibet down to His Holiness. They reduce His Holiness down to this kind of dramatic event of flight, rather than, for example, 60 years of democratic reform in exile, all of those struggles and building up a government in exile and everything on those lines. These are mammoth achievements, and they tend to they kind of fall into shadow behind this kind of drama of flight. And also it reduces Tibet to an event in the past. I mean, the title of the film is Never Forget Tibet, but in a sense, it sort of says Tibet exists in the past, rather than a place that still exists today, still with 7 million Tibetans in there, still with, and with a future as well that is yet to be decided to a large extent. And I think that focus on the past it's to a certain extent one of the things that is, in a sense, all that is wrong with the Tibetan cause today. It really doesn't think very much about the future. It talks about independence, and they talk about the middle way, and they talk about those kinds of things. But there is this constant focus on the trauma of the past, and one can understand that trauma. But at the same time, sometimes you have to move beyond that. And His Holiness has been pushing and pushing and pushing for 60 years to move the issue beyond himself, to democratize it. The video the documentary does actually interview, for example, the first elected Sikyong, Lobsang Sangye. We're now on our second, Pemba Tsering, who is visiting Scotland next week, in fact. And Lobsang Sangye, this person inherited the entire political authority of the Dalai Lama. When the Dalai Lama retired from office in 2011 and gave up those political rights to an elected president. And that move was something he'd been pushing for against significant Tibetan resistance for 60 years. I mean, he'd worked hard at that. And I find slightly to sort of reduce it down to this story of the flight. If that makes it all the story, then we have a problem.
Well, clearly the world is fascinated with the Dalai Lama, Sam, and it's impossible to talk about the Dalai Lama without looking at or mentioning the recent news headlines as footage circulated showing him asking a boy to suck his tongue. How do Tibetans perceive this media coverage, and what are some of the traditions that may contextualise this?
I'll leave. I mean, Martin will probably know about more about the traditions that textualize this, but I'll speak to the Tibetan reaction. My sense is that Tibetans are really distressed and hurt by the way that this has been covered. I think that it's quite understandable that that we're very aware of the existence of sexual abuse within religion. We're sensitive to that, and of course, there needs to be, scrutiny and so forth. But I don't think that that's what's happening here. It seems that any kind of reasonable attention to the context of the event where this happened, or to the people who are involved, or to the actually taking care to see what Tibetans have to say about the cultural, linguistic things that might have contributed to what happens in that very short, decontextualized clip. If we take those things into account, then it's clear that it's really not tenable to see this in a sinister way. It's clearly something. I think a mistake by His Holiness in a sense, a misjudgment, but certainly an innocent one, and not something sinister. And I think Tibetans are really hurt that perhaps people have not taken the time or the care to really look at what might be happening there.
And these are important factors. Just briefly, Martin, can you extend on that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean to begin with, the idea that this is some kind of notion of sexual harassment or abuse is nonsense in this context. Tibetans have long, particularly, they use the tongue to say hello, all right? They stick their tongues out to say hello. It's an ancient practice, is about 1,000 years old, to show good intention and everything on those lines. And I've actually seen this kind of game being played that His Holiness did there with, back in the 1980s in northern Tibet when I first went there when I was 18. Now, I appreciate the point. When I saw it, I was a brittle Londoner at that point in time, and it kind of freaked me out. But it is a Tibetan thing, and it is something they do. And it means something fundamentally different. And I'd agree with Sam in this one. Tibetans are horrified by the way in which people have responded, deeply hurt by it, particularly with reference to His Holiness. It's seen as a massive misunderstanding. And they sit there and they sort of say, Westerners have been saying they're terribly interested in Tibet all this time. And after literally millions of hours of interviews with His Holiness and a man whose life has been under the spotlight since, his absolute youth, completely. There is no sign of anything like that whatsoever. Well, and Tibetans are just saying, well, couldn't you cut us and him a little slack here?
Yeah. Well, thank you for contextualising that for us. And thank you to you both, Dr. Sam Pehrson and Dr. Martin A. Mills. And if you want to see the Never Forget Tibet, the Dalai Lama's Untold Story, he'll be playing at a range of cinemas across Scotland on April 19th. On the way, the news, but first, Clean Bandit and Jess Glynn.